Hi, everyone, and welcome to Now and Men, the podcast on changing masculinities and challenging norms. I'm Sandy Ruxton, and as ever, I'm delighted to be joined by my good friend and co host, Stephen Burrell, who's in Melbourne, Australia. How are you, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm good, thanks, Sandy. Yeah, hi, everybody. I'd like to just begin, as always, just by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung people here in Melbourne. And yeah, something I have seen recently, which might be of interest to some of our listeners, was a very good documentary I saw at the cinema called It's Never Over, Jeff Buckley. Don't know if people are fans of Jeff Buckley, the musician. He was very popular in the 90s, like really powerful music, incredibly beautiful voice. And the documentary really depicts, also his kind of sensitivity and how he kind of pushed boundaries when it comes to gender, but also, how he really struggled with issues like his relationship with his father and so on, and eventually tragically died. So actually, it's a very interesting film in that respect, which covers a lot of the issues we might also talk about today. But yeah, how are you doing, Sandy?
I'm doing very well, thanks, Stephen. I recently went to an evening of poetry, comedy, and conversation called Masculinity in Uncertain Times, which was set up by Equimundo and Beyond Equality. I mean, both of those are organisations that we've had on the podcast before. And it was part of the sort of fringe Marmalade Festival, or so-called Marmalade Festival, which runs alongside the annual Skoll World Forum on Social Entrepreneurship here in Oxford. I think they tend to call it the Davos for Good, but I don't know any more than that, I'm afraid. But it was there that I first heard Sam Browne reading some of his poems, and they were so great I thought our listeners might like to hear them too. So Sam is a spoken word poet from Southend in Essex. He's 21 years old. He originally set out to be a stand-up comedian before pivoting to poetry. And since then, he's developed an online following of over 100,000 followers across all platforms and tens of millions of views. He's won awards for his activism work, numerous poetry slams, and was more recently featured in the BBC documentary EastEnders Investigates the Manosphere. He now performs at conferences, summits, in schools, and at some of the biggest poetry nights in the world. He's currently touring the UK with his show The Manosphere and Other Fun Shapes, and he's got another tour coming up in September.
Yeah, so hi, Sam. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. It's great to have you.
Oh, hi. It's lovely to be here.
So we thought it might be good if we could perhaps begin with you reading one of your poems. Perhaps that can give our audience a kind of flavour of the
Yeah,
kind
of
of raw
course.
emotion and conversational style of your work. And we can then perhaps explore that further. So I think you're going to start by reading a poem called Hinge and Harry Kane. So yeah, over to you when you're ready. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. A girl on Hinge the other day asked me when was the last time I'd cried. I thought that's a bit deep for a dating app on a Wednesday night. And we're talking about an app here where connection is simplified to algorithms and swipes. I'm used to being asked my coffee order and playing two truths, one lie, and even them won't say chai in case they think I'm too much of a feminine guy. Nevertheless, the question had nestled into my mind, so I asked myself, well, when was the last time I cried? Well, there was the end of life is beautiful and the whole of past lives. Looking up at the Sahara night sky, when I left all my mates in Sydney behind pretty much every time I say goodbye. When I worked in a pub and the local came in for the first time without his wife and I didn't need to ask him what had happened, I could see the pain just in the way he drank that pint. When I was 14 and my friend Peter died and I was on antidepressants so I couldn't cry, I'm counting the pain I felt for that one on the inside. When my nonna called me her best friend because in the short span of a month I saw her twice. When my mum asked me to stop drinking and I told her I would and I could see the relief in her eyes. When I asked her why she didn't stop me in the first place and she said, well, fuck Sam, I tried. When I realized that I didn't want to die, and then when I realized that I really, really love being alive, but this is just Hinge, bruv. So I typed, remember last year's World Cup when Kane missed that pen? Yeah, I might have shed a tear then.
Thank you. That's really powerful. And also funny and emotional and yeah. Would you like to say anything about some of the themes you're addressing there and why they matter to you? I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on there, right? Things like modern dating culture, pressures around traditional masculinity, the dominance of football. Yeah, what kind of comes out for you from that poem?
Yeah, I think what I think one of the main things for me is that I wanted to show how one of the basically, one of the things that I really enjoy exploring is how someone such as myself, who is like a queer man who does not exist really within many deeply patriarchal spaces anymore, right, can find themselves basically feeling very uncomfortable with the idea of not upholding the patriarchy or not being patriarchal or still exist within the confines of that, right? Or like traditional masculinity or whatever you want to call it, right? And I think one of the ways in which that still happens to me massively is when I think about the way that I am perceived by women. And that's not me trying to say that I believe that women um, are necessarily all attracted to, or I definitely don't believe that women are all attracted to patriarchal values, and I definitely don't believe that most women could be attracted. I don't know what women are attracted to. What it is that I'm trying to say is that I think that there is something that was nailed into me and many other men as a child, which is that like the traditional form of masculinity is what women want. And of course, that was not taught to me by women, it was taught to me by men. But the traditional understanding of what masculinity is what women want. And therefore, even now, in my progressive enlightened state, as I stupidly call it, as I ironically call it, or whatever, um, I struggle with the idea of not being um, the man that people might expect me to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's research, isn't there, which shows that what young men think women want them to be is actually very distorted from what young
Oh
women
yeah.
themselves say.
What's really interesting about this, because I spend a lot of time speaking about this idea, and I think what's really interesting is that there's two like big thoughts I have on it. The first one is that I think it goes to show another thing which is backed by research, which is the fact that like men are so much more likely to believe another man than they are a woman, even when that goes against a woman's experience, or when it's speaking about women, right? Which is like crazy. I remember growing up, and there was a whole thing about how like people used to say like to you as a boy, you don't ask the fish how it wants to be caught, you ask the fisherman how to catch it, right? And like that's like how they would describe how you should speak to women. It's like don't ask a woman, she's got no idea. Ask the guy who's always getting with women, which is completely absurd. And
Yeah.
like it plays into this idea of a singular woman who is attracted to one thing, right? But anyways, the other thought I have is that this can often be seen as like a very compelling counter narrative to like traditional masculinity or the patriarchy, right? That you turn around to a young man and you say, uh, look, this isn't even what women are attracted to. What women are attracted to is a sensitive, kind, gentle man. And the problem with teaching young men that is that once again, it just reinforces the idea that there is a that women are attracted to some singular thing
Yeah.
or some singular man, and that they are all attracted to the same thing, and that if you become that thing, you then deserve sex, right? Or and if we teach men that they have to be kind and gentle for the purpose of female validation or sex, we'll find them being just as violent as ever before, but far more terrifying because you can't spot them in the same way because they're dressing up as somewhat less harmful men, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. Yeah. But it also, yeah, and it also what you said. I mean, it is ridiculous, isn't it? That like, many men are like going to get advice from these angry men online about how to like meet women or date women rather than just having conversations with actual women. But yeah, but it's a really good point there. So maybe just asking a bit more about yourself. So
Yeah.
as you said, you started off in comedy actually. So how and why did you then move from that into poetry? Was that something you were always interested in, or did it emerge in school? Or yeah,
Yeah. I wrote a poem for the first time when I was about 14 years old. My dad forced me to go to a local arts workshop one day.
right.
I went along. I remember I like like a very deeply I hung out with like football lads, right? And we all drank and took drugs, and etc., etc., from about the age of 13 years old, right? And it was all very much that. And I never felt like I fit in. I was always kind of pretending, but I didn't really know that at the time. And I remember going to this poetry workshop when I was 14, and I remember just being like immediately accepted. And the people speaking about the things that I wanted to speak about and talking in the ways, and everybody seemed, I guess the best word for it is liberated to some extent, which is really weird. I think that like um, people speak about like the man cage or whatever, right? And like this like traditional and very restrictive idea of masculinity. And I think I was the main people who were on it in this group were um, women and non-binary people who had essentially um, removed themselves from or tried to remove themselves at a very young age and had become like incredibly liberated in their sexuality and their beliefs in traditional male and female roles. And I think that's something that like men have so much to learn, especially from women, queer, non-binary people, and some men as well. But yeah, if that makes sense. And I think that was one, like just being within that environment was just insane. I was essentially watching people be individuals and being okay with that. I remember almost like very quickly in this workshop, almost like having pushback to like everything that was said or everything that was done because it was so far removed from what I thought I was allowed to do, not from what I
Mm.
wanted to do. Um, yeah, and then of course I wrote a poem and it went down amazingly and everyone was like, "You're fantastic." And then I went back to school the next day and realized I couldn't tell anybody about it, and if they found out, that would be the end of me. So I never spoke about it again and I stopped writing. Um, about 5 years later, I was 19 and I started doing stand up at 17. Um, and one time one of my friends turned around to me and he said, your stand up is just all the things you think people are saying about you behind your back, but you're saying it first on stage. And actually, all of my comedy was this like deeply self-deprecating humor, but not from a place of like, oh, I thought it was funny or I was okay with it. It was almost from a place of like, I'm gonna get this out there. And I didn't realize that at the time, but like, I actually think I was basically like bullying myself on stage to some extent, right? And that's not to say that that's what I think self-deprecating humor is, but what I'm saying, what I was doing was that. Did that for a couple of years and just kind of loved it, but didn't love it at the same. I think partly because of that. And then one day I was living in Melbourne and I sat down and I was completely removed. When I moved to Melbourne, I didn't really know that many people, and suddenly for like the first time in my life I could like do things in isolation and no one could have possibly known about them. Um, and very quickly I started discovering my sexuality. Um, it was almost like immediate. It was almost like you just kind of like let this kid out of a jar and he was, but at the same time I was struggling to contend with all of it because it didn't feel right to me that I was engaged in all of this stuff. Um, yeah, and then eventually I started writing poetry, just one morning.
Mm.
And that Hinge poem that I just said, that was the first poem I wrote. Coming back to it 5 years later. Um, and it was kind of me trying to make sense of everything that had happened to me in my teenage life. And then I was doing stand up at the time, and I had a gig on the Tuesday and I didn't have one on the Wednesday. And I thought, oh God, I might as well do a poetry night. No one's ever going to find out. So on the Tuesday, I did a stand up. It was a night. It was horrible. It was. I hated it. It was like a specifically bad one. I remember. And I remember being like, I don't think I ever want to do this again. And the Wednesday, I went to a poetry night, and afterwards, everybody cheered and clapped for me, and then they all walked around saying how incredible I was, and told me to go and do this thing and this thing and this thing. Remember thinking, oh God, these people are so much
Mm.
nicer. Why have I been doing why have I been doing the comedy for all this time? All of that was a horrible sort of environment in which people were putting people down all the time, and and the audiences want you to do badly so they can heckle you and things like that. I was like, oh my God, this is so supportive and wonderful. What have I been doing? So then I just started doing poetry when I moved back to London. I just did more and more and more. Um, and yeah, and here we are now.
So how do you see the relationship between masculinity and poetry.
Mm.
Because poetry is often seen as kind of feminine or unmanly by
Yes. Yeah,
boys
yeah,
and men, and engaging with it is some sort of gender threat, leading you
yeah.
to respond defensively. I mean, how do you overcome that perception? And yeah.
It's funny. I think I always say that anybody who thinks that poetry is inherently feminine and progressive is giving Bukowski much more credit than he's due. Like as in like there are, trust me, there is some deeply problematic and inherently like patriarchal part. There is some like poetry out there that is incredibly misogynistic and will do all the things that you wouldn't expect modern or
Mm,
what people now consider to be poetry to do. Partly because people learn poetry from a syllabus, and therefore everything that is picked out is stuff that is like wildly accepted.
mm,
And also because a lot of social media poetry is obviously gonna exist. But I think that it's less, how do I put it? I think there's less something that seems to me to be masculine about poetry or deeply feminine about poetry, but I think there is something vulnerable in a lot of poetry that does seem to be. Um, I think we're now at a stage with young men in which kind of engaging in any form of art in a way that you might care about it seems embarrassing. I mean, like you actually see like sort of some of the last four art forms which seem uh, to be like accepted by like young men. Things like rap, for example. We like saw like a huge surge in like mumble rap and like very like hazy rap in which again this kind of like idea of like nonchalant rapping in which it seems that people don't care about the art form they're engaging in, and it's almost like the only way that young men are allowed to engage in art in to some extent within like that restrictive sense is in a way which is completely and utterly um it's almost as if the artist themselves isn't engaging in the art, or doesn't
mm,
care about the art. And that's not what I think mumble rap is, but I'm just saying that like that does exist.
mm,
Um, and therefore I think we're like now at a stage in which the idea in which I could go on stage and turn around and say like I care about poetry, and I care about this poem. And this is me being vulnerable. This is actually how I feel. There is something that doesn't seem to fit inside the man box or whatever
mm.
within that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah. I was thinking whilst you're talking about other art forms. I mean, there was an article in the Guardian newspaper here at the weekend about ballet boys.
Yeah, yeah. My brother's a
The
ballet dancer.
organisation.
Yeah,
Your brother's a ballet dancer, okay? And
yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah.
there was this moment when Billy Elliot, the
Right. Yeah,
film,
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah.
arrived in about 2000, and then suddenly it kind of became okay
Mm.
for a certain set of, maybe should we say, of young boys, men, to take part in that art form. And that increased, and then I think COVID happened, and then things dropped off, and there's all things about how the curriculum is changing as well, which made it more difficult to fit in, more sort of humanities type subjects. But it feels like similar sorts of processes are happening in other art forms as well. And there's something important about the performance part of it, which
Oh
clearly
yeah,
you were engaged in as a comedian, but you've
yeah,
translated that to poetry as well, and within that, male performance is also a thing, isn't it?
yeah.
Maybe adopting a stage persona, you know, as opposed to how you are on a sort of day to day level. It's all
A
very
hundred
very
percent.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. It's interesting. I actually think um, it's very yeah. It's always really hard as an artist to separate the idea of a persona from yourself
Mm,
because it appears to be yourself to everybody else, whereas so clearly that it isn't. Um, and I find that really hard. Um, I think a lot of artists find it really hard, especially
mm,
artists who grew up with mental health problems. I think a lot of us, including myself, end up separating all of the things that we love about ourselves, and we're taught to love about ourselves, and we call that an artist, and we create that, and we make it a brand, and
mm,
we are that whenever we're working. And then all of the things that we hated about ourselves growing up, they can actually live with inside the self who exists. There's something
Mm.
like slightly Freudian about it, like this kind of like id and ego and superego idea, right?
Mm.
And I think it's like really, sometimes when people ask me, "Oh, why do you work so hard?" I do sometimes think that part of the answer is so that I can be Sam Browne, the poet, for longer and don't actually have to necessarily confront the realities of the parts of me that I dislike, which is what I see when I close my eyes in the evenings.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I wanted to ask you a bit more also about the major focus of your work on challenging misogynistic attitudes,
Yeah.
particularly the manosphere. I mean, you explore how young men are influenced by online spaces. And I've read
Mm.
that you aim to quote you, untangle and unravel the web that is internalized misogyny. Now, where does that interest in tackling misogyny and violence against women come from?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. I basically grew up making a lot of misogynistic jokes with a lot of people, believing that it was harmless. And I always think as well, like when young men are doing this, it's not. I was taught to do that. It wasn't. It was validated countlessly through experiences with older men, with like older males, with like it was. I'm not at any point turning around and saying that like young men are responsible for like perpetuating misogyny or making misogynistic jokes because like it's something that's like validated through society, through school, like all of these things, right? Um, the problem was that we were always kind of taught that it was harmless, and that was the whole thing. And then I remember when I then went on to basically, as I became a sort of more warm presence to be around and a more gentle presence to be around and someone who could be trusted, suddenly women started disclosing things that had happened to them to me far more regularly. And I realized that the reason why I didn't know about this before was because I could have been seen as the problem, right? I was this like very loud, laddish guy. And suddenly when I wasn't that, I began to learn to the extent that violence against women and girls was affecting like almost every woman that I knew. And I immediately felt lied to. I felt like I had been taught to perpetuate like to perpetuate and joke about violence that I was kind of taught didn't exist, if that makes sense. Like to me, growing up, sexual assault was like something that happened down an alleyway, and the way that you avoided it was by making sure that you walked girls home at night, and then they would never be assaulted. And what nobody told me was that the reality, which is that like the majority of the time when this is happening, it is within the household or from a friend at a party or whatever. And as I began to see like more and more and more of that happen repeatedly through like stories that were told to me, I just became more and more upset by how by the things that I felt like a huge sense of guilt basically for realizing that all the people I'd been joking with growing up, a select few of them hadn't been joking, and that I'd essentially been perpetuating a culture which then went on to harm people within my community. Um, and it didn't sit well with the kind of way that I wanted to be. And it certainly didn't sit well with what I thought men should be. And I think that this would have happened uh, at a similar time to the whole like man or bear conversation and all of those kinds of things that like came up, and where we started to have much bigger societal conversations about the way that women felt about men and how dangerous they are, etc., etc. And I remember my immediate reaction being so upset at the idea that like men were turning around and not looking introspectively, but like immediately lashing straight out again. And how I felt like very sad to be associated with that.
Mm.
Um, yeah. And I then went on to, and I think that a lot of my work stems from the idea that I refuse to believe that anybody could be intrinsically evil. And I do not, there is something very defeatist about the idea that 50% of the population of the world or almost 50% of the population of this world could be intrinsically bad or violent or whatever. I think that there's something so depressing
Mm.
about that idea that I refuse to engage in. And women who engage in it, I don't have any animosity towards. A lot of the time that comes from pain, and it's like it's them protecting them. So, and like again, I can't stress enough, I have not got that experience. I do not want to. But for me, as a man, I have to believe. There's really no point of getting out of bed in the morning if I don't believe that, you know. I think there's something very deeply depressing about the idea. So from then I had to ask myself the question of why is this happening? And I really started to question my own understandings of sex and women and the way that I was taught. And there's so many different things that I've explored since. But yeah, yeah, it's something that I'm like constantly thinking about, basically. Yeah.
Mm.
What do you think? What do you think led you to have that kind of realization and to start seeing things differently? Like, was it at the same time as you were engaging with poetry and the arts, or do you think there were other things going on? Like, because did it mean you had to leave behind some of those friendship groups? And
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah, there's a couple of things on that. The first one I think is that like it's really important that I always mention that all of this come from like very brave women who
mm,
disclosed their experiences to me.
mm,
Like that is the reality is women who had the courage um to turn to me and say, this is something that happened to me. Like that
mm,
is the I don't like using the word brave because I think it's been overused to describe sort of, But anyways, um, yeah, women who had the courage to say that, and that is basically what I was confronted with such a huge amount of female suffering um, in a very quick time span, and then the more that I began to speak about it with women that I knew, the more it would come up in conversation, and suddenly it just became like overwhelmingly terrifying. So I couldn't even like imagine how. Yeah, it was just terrifying. It was absolutely terrifying. So yeah, I think it came from a place of that was kind of the catalyst. But to speak, so I think this is really interesting. I think that we developed a belief. There was something that became very like big, a movement that became very big a while back, which was the idea that like um, if men have misogynistic friends, they should cut them off, right? And that you should remove yourself from anybody who's racist or misogynistic or anything like that, because that person is a bad person, and therefore, and I think that that is arguably the most dangerous thing that we could choose to do as men,
mm,
right? It's like I, as like a young, like white man, who like has like all of that privilege and can like be straight presenting when I want to be, right? Um, like I am the one of the only people who can actually engage in this conversation with young men in a way that isn't a threat to my health, right? Or to like I am so much less likely to receive a threat of violence because people will still think that I'm part of their club, if that makes sense. And if you
mm,
do have mates who are misogynistic, or if your son has mates who are or whatever, the best thing that they can do is start to challenge and not like turn around in the pub, slam their
Mm.
hands on the table and be like, that's wrong. But just start to ask genuine questions of these beliefs, where they come from and who they think they're helping, and da 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 da. And like that is how you change society. That's how like that's the goal. Removing yourself from these people and letting them exist within inside some sort of racist, misogynistic echo chamber is I mean that's what fascism feeds off, right?
mm,
Mm.
Um, and I think that like we need a diversity of beliefs within our communities, and if you just make your community a community of progressives and turn away from everybody that you knew, then you're not doing that. And I think that is a problem.
mm. Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. And that is a huge problem in our society, isn't it, currently?
Yeah.
But okay, well, perhaps maybe now, would you like to read another poem?
Yeah,
Maybe
let's do
your
it.
like your poem "Like a Man." Would you like to read that?
Yeah, 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 yeah. Yeah. We'll see if I remember it. Here we go. Um, Men with thumbs pressed inside their clenched fists never learnt how to protect. I learnt how to fight in year six. Karate lessons. Miss Turner gave out flapjacks at the end. So every week I learnt how to be a man and to eat flapjacks. Sometimes I don't feel like a man, but I know I should be, because my father was and his father was too. Sometimes I don't feel like flapjacks. Sometimes I think to be a bad person is to let yourself down, but to be a bad man is to let down all those who came before you, to bear the weight of confusion, a meaningless definition generations have tried to live up to. I don't know what it is to be a man, but I do know that if you put your thumbs inside your fist and punch, you break them. So sometimes when I'm scared or angry, I do it. I hold my thumbs tight and I go to punch something. And in that moment of therapeutic self-destruction, I feel like a man.
Thank you. Could you perhaps explain a bit more for us about the kind of tension at play in those lines? Sometimes I don't feel like a man, but I know I should be because my father was and his father too. Like what's going on there with that kind of intergenerational transmission of these ideas about masculinity, and how can we try to break free from that? I suppose because I guess sometimes there's this idea, isn't there, that it's almost like predetermined for us, and it's very hard to actually break out of that. I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. I think that like we model most of our behavior and most of our understanding off of the people around us, right? And I think what's interesting is it's essentially so hard to break away from the confines of what you think masculinity is when you feel as though breaking away from that is to not, how do I put it? I think I feel often feel some guilt in the idea that all the men before me had to uphold this idea of the patriarch, and like to some extent, it is like a life mission of many men, right? To like live within these confines of masculinity, right? And I think I'm very lucky that I have like a father who I wouldn't necessarily say does that, but then does in other situations, and it's really interesting, like the change that I've seen in him throughout my life, in which like as we've had a more progressive conversation about masculinity, um, and my brother's a ballet dancer, and I'm a poet who speaks about this all the time, how much he's shifted, and like that's like incredible to me and like so beautiful to see, right? And I think that like my grandmother, again on my English side, she like wouldn't almost didn't let my grandfather live up to a lot of those kind of understandings of what should be expected of her as a woman, right? She like was very much like I will not pick up your trousers off the floor. You can learn how to do that. And we always joke that he's done the washing up for his whole life, like in with her, right? So it doesn't exist completely within those confines.
Mm.
But I think that within every man or almost every man there is still this restriction that when you don't engage in that, there is something emasculating about it.
Mm.
And I think if I think about going back, I think I feel almost a sense of guilt that by not living up to that, I kind of break some deep culture or some understanding that everybody else did. Does that make sense? As in, I
Yeah.
think like, yeah, I think there's something terrifying about the idea that everybody else did it. And I
Mm.
actually breaking away from that very naturally
Mm.
is quite scary. I don't
Mm.
necessarily think that that line is about, because I was kind of reflecting on it there. I don't think it's actually about my father and my
Mm.
grandfather. I think it's more the idea of just a culture, right? It's the idea of
Mm.
Mm,
breaking a
Mm.
culture. Yeah.
mm.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
don't know
Because
if that
I
was the clearest answer, but it
no,
was because
it
it was a really good
was.
question.
Yeah, no, and because I
Um,
think often with parents, like maybe part of the reason why they're teaching us this stuff is because they think they need to protect us, right? And that if they don't teach us like be tough, be a
100%.
man, then how's society going to treat you, right? Like,
Y-
yeah.
Yeah. I think we're going to see something really interesting, actually. This is something this already exists, but I think we're seeing the next generation, as in like what we now see as like toddlers, etc. I think that there are a large proportion of very progressive parents now
Mm.
who are so aware, because there's so much literature of like the ways that you speak to young children, etc., and the way that that reinforces patriarchy and like traditional masculinity. And I think it'd be really interesting to see what those young men look like when they become young men, when they grow up.
Mm.
Um, yeah, like my best mate Mark, he's got two wonderful children. I see the way that him and Molly, his partner, like they're just literally the best parents I could ever imagine, right? And the way that they speak to their son is just like, I mean, it's inspiration. It provides me with so much hope for the future of young men, and it will be really interesting. Um, Not in a sort of lab experiment kind of way, but just in a way
Absolutely.
of, I think it'll be really interesting as he grows up to kind of see how much of it I think every time I speak to him, I'm almost like, I don't want you to leave this wonderful safe space of a house that your parents have created for you. I never
Yeah.
want you to touch a
Yeah.
phone or go to
Yeah.
school or anything, because
Mm.
there is a father out there that doesn't mean anything by it, but is teaching their son all of the worst things, and a mother out there who's teaching their son all of the worst things that we know to be about restrictive masculinity and the patriarchy. And like that kid's gonna end up talking to him, and then like how much does that affect him? Like what does he stand on? And suddenly like you ask yourself the question like how much can a parent impact? And I think they do, but like they don't have complete control, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. There was another
yeah,
powerful line in there about therapeutic self-destruction. I think that really
yeah, yeah,
sums
yeah,
things up
yeah.
quite well, doesn't it? Do you want to say anything about, where do you think that pain comes from, and how does it
It's
relate to what we're
interesting.
talking about being a man and your own
Yeah,
experiences and yeah.
I used to have a joke when I did stand up that was something like weak men self-harm, real men run ultra marathons, right? I think that men engage in what we wouldn't consider to be self-harm, but actually just
Mm,
a very masculine activities.
mm,
Uh, Things like punching walls and training with injuries, which is like such a massive problem when we like speak about like young men, and like the way in which a lot of men work out, which is like the idea, like that whole like no pain, no gain kind of mentality,
mm,
that like then gets taken to an absolute extreme. All of these things that we deem to be like deeply feminine or like a really big problem for young women, things like eating disorders and things like self-harm, which like I think as a young man were always really associated with what women did when they were sad, and what men do. Well, men don't get sad, or when men get sad they kill themselves, or something like that. But actually, I mean, I think that like, to be honest with you, a lot of the things that I engaged in as part of like gym culture were like very
mm,
simply um forms of like eating disorders and
mm,
self-harm, right? Like the idea,
mm,
like I remember like tearing my AC like in my shoulder and going back to the gym the next day and like
mm,
working that shoulder out,
mm,
and it like killing with pain, but like that must have been good,
mm,
and like tracking calories and I mean there's now like become a bigger conversation about like the male obsession with protein,
Mm.
like becoming some form of eating disorder and things like that. So yeah,
mm,
I don't know if it's like on the same level as a lot of more extreme eating disorders, but anyways, I couldn't speak on
mm,
that. But yeah, um, so that is. I think that there's something within that. So I don't think that therapeutic self-destruction necessarily pertains to the idea of suicide. I think it pertains to like the little things that I was taught were how men interacted with their emotions to some extent. You know, like
mm,
if you get angry, you punch a wall. I remember once actually, we were in Iceland, as in the shop, not the country, and we were at me and my dad were buying something, and I used to punch walls a lot as a kid, and we were buying something, and the guy in the queue in front of us, this huge guy, he had a massive cast around his hand, and as a kid, turned to him and said, "Hey, how did that happen?" Turned around and he said, I hit a wall. And he said, I got really angry one day and I punched a wall. And I remember him saying it with almost like this sense of pride. Like, look at how strong I am. When I punch walls, I break my knuckles, you know?
mm,
Mm.
And I really romanticized it, and I remember hitting a wall
mm,
once, like almost like after that and going like, fuck, oh, my knuckles aren't breaking yet, and like they're like, yeah, I think that, yeah. It's weird. I think there's quite a universal experience of young men, but I just don't think it's something that we necessarily think about or see within those parameters.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Welcome back. So perhaps, Sam, you could now read your poem Ben's Purpose and we could talk about
Of
it
course.
afterwards.
I've got this mate Ben, and he reckons his life is purposeless, which is a shame because it is. I'm not kidding, if Ben left today, the world would keep spinning, not much would change. To the world, Ben is pointless. I mean, it really gains very little from his existence. In fact, when you take into account carbon emissions, Ben is a bit of a nuisance. But to me, Ben being alive is a big win. He brightens up my day, puts a smile on my face, makes me feel better about whatever is in my way. I love Ben, and his importance is not something I could possibly overstate. So when Ben told me his life was purposeless, I had to disagree, and then look introspectively, how could Ben be so unaware of how much he means to me? I suppose a decent hypothesis, one I'm working on at the minute, is that I never told him. That could be it. In fact, it probably is for someone who couldn't overstate Ben's importance. I don't often state it. So this time I thought I should, and I did. I told Ben I love him, and he broke down in tears because a drop of water means nothing. But put a million, a billion, all flowing. That's how dams break. That's how rivers become flooded. A drop of water means nothing, but when it drops from one man's eye into the arms of his brother, it becomes the beginning of something. A free-flowing system, a river of connection. I've got this mate Ben, and he reckons his life is purposeless, and I don't agree. I stop him and say, Ben, how could your life be purposeless when you mean so much to me?
Thanks for that powerful reading. I mean, on the one hand, it's kind of uncomfortable to hear how a young man can believe, that their life lacks purpose in the way that you describe. But on the other, it's also positive, I think, and it affirms the value of friendship, connection, support, the importance of men actively building and voicing relationships of love and care between them. Is it right to see the poem in that way, that it is kind of double-edged in that sense?
Yeah, yeah, I think when I first started writing poetry with the intention, a lot of my poetry, not all of it, I write poetry about really dumb things as well. I recently wrote one about a micro influencer walking into a micro brewery and drinking a small beer with his small hands. But I when I write poetry with the intention of kind of challenging, generally it's like my personal understanding of masculinity, or documenting my personal change of beliefs or whatever, right? Or my battle with restrictive masculinity or whatever, right? I first started out by doing it in a great example is like a poem that like a man, right? Which seems to be very powerful, but to a young man who doesn't want to engage in a conversation about masculinity, is not something that they're going to enjoy at all, right? Because it immediately alienates them from the discussion by like head on addressing masculinity. And I kind of tried to look for the if restrictive masculinity is a wall, I tried to look for the kind of like little like cracks or the weaknesses within its boundaries, almost in a Trojan horse style of like what can I push to these people that they will accept, not knowing that it is a form of positive masculinity. And I think brotherhood, the idea of brotherhood, is actually um, can very easily be changed into the idea of being there for another person, being vulnerable with another person, being kind to another person. That all of these things that we wouldn't necessarily um, think of within restricted masculinity all exist within the idea of brotherhood, right? When I think about brotherhood, it's something that men will find easy to engage in the conversation with because it doesn't seem like it really makes them challenge some or emasculates them in any way. Um, but at the same time, it's very positive,
Mm.
and helps them achieve perhaps a more positive sense of masculinity. The second of those is mental health. I think that like what like the manosphere, or it's kind of hard to describe. The manosphere is such a broad term, right? But what a lot of what people consider to be like the manosphere 1.0 or the manosphere influencers, they really like weaponize the mental health conversation against women, and we're like, hey men, you know how you will feel terrible? The reason why that is because people are telling you that you should be subservient or like whatever it was, like this whole idea that like men were
Mm.
becoming submissive, and that's what was making them that was what was making them sad. As if men haven't like historically been absurdly submissive. I mean, like the concept of a soldier is the most submissive thing you can possibly think about ever. It's just like packaged as this like idea of courage, but really it's somebody who you don't know telling you to go and lay down your life for something you don't understand. I mean, it's like the ultimate for. Anyways, it doesn't matter. But my point is that these we have this kind of understanding of of mental health that was kind of like that they legitimized, and now actually you can now start a conversation with most men who want to exist with inside or choose to exist with inside restricted masculinity about mental health, and very quickly that actually makes them engaging ideas and conversations that don't exist within that. So I think one of the powers of Ben's purpose is that it touches on both mental health and brotherhood in a
Mm.
way that like young men feel like they can engage in without emasculating themselves, whilst also suggesting some like more positive ideas,
Right.
if that makes sense.
Right. I mean, your poems are very often centered on men and are about men.
Yeah,
And I mean, I'm interested because you've talked quite a bit in the earlier part of our conversation about the influence of women as well. But
sure. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
women don't tend to appear in your, well, at least in the poems you selected
Yeah,
to read today, they don't appear so much. It's quite
yeah,
interesting
it's
sort of
interesting.
contradiction, isn't it? You know,
Yes.
but you're not writing only for men, are you? You're writing for everybody.
No,
I assume you would say that.
100%. This is a really good question. Um, how do I put it? First of all, I think that there are a lot of the like broader mental health poems are not male male. And I think anytime a man speaks is vulnerable or speaks about mental health, it immediately becomes connected to the idea of masculinity, if that makes sense. And I
Mm.
think that like a large proportion of my poems are just like me being vulnerable, and I don't think they're actually inherently about men. But because I'm a man saying them, something it then becomes a part of a conversation straight away. Uh, but yeah, do you know what? There's Joel Taylor, the incredible poet, once wrote, "Men are broken things, breaking things." Right? And I think that like to me, when I look at like two problems that I watched destroy the lives of young people growing up, it was male suicide and it was sexual assault. And both of those things to me stem from male violence. Um, and it stems from a patriarchal understanding of men to be people who, when they experience pain, act out in violence. And I think that, like, for that reason, a lot of my work centers around trying to speak to the problem, which is male violence, and therefore trying to speak to young men. Um, whereas I think that there is another conversation about mental health, which is
Mm.
actually not gendered in any way. And I think this is the problem. This is a very academic podcast, so I'm going to say something which is like not going to be backed by research whatsoever. But I am of the belief that the idea of a male loneliness epidemic or the idea of a men's mental health problem is like ridiculously reductive. I think the reason why we see higher rates of male suicide is because men have a significantly more violent solution to basically every problem that they experience. Um, and I don't think that men are necessarily hurting more than women. I just think they're hurting themselves worse than women, basically. Um, and I think that the idea of suicide is seen by men just culturally as a different thing as it is to women. I think that's like has a big part to play. But I don't necessarily. I often really struggle with the idea of some like men's mental health epidemic or whatever. Well, I do think that it is a mental health epidemic. I'll accept as well that perhaps women have better communities around them, just in general, like they're more likely to reach out, etc., etc. But
Mm.
I think it is really reductive, and therefore when I write general mental health poetry about my mental health, I could very easily be like, and this is because I'm a man, but I don't think it is. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one thing I was wondering, Sam, given there will be so many young men, young people, as you say, struggling with all the kinds of issues you've been talking about today. And this perhaps sounds a bit trite, but I was just wondering, like for younger men than yourself, is there anything you would wish you could like advise them? Like would you say to them, go and explore the arts, go and explore poetry or feminism, perhaps? Like yeah, is there anything in particular you think would be helpful advice to give, just to
Yeah.
help, just deal with the world we're living in, I suppose? Yeah.
Do you know, is I would turn around and I would say, like, the one piece of kind of like advice that I wish I had received is that, like, if you do not feel like you fit in, you do, you're just not in the right place. And in a lot of this sort of, especially like young men, like in a lot of the like school climate that you exist in, nobody actually fits in there. What you are experiencing is a performance. Um, Most of the things that your friends are telling that you about women or about men or their experience, da, 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 a lot of it is just lies. And if you feel like you don't fit in with inside that box, there are people that you can talk to, that you can be friends with, who you will feel a significantly deeper sense of relief. I spent a large proportion of my life trying to kind of be at the top of the social ladder at school, and therefore found myself um, basically being a person that I wasn't, so that I could exist there. And that made me deeply, deeply, deeply unhappy. And I wish I had found my people sooner in life, really. Um, and one of the best ways you can do that is engaging in the arts. I am a big believer in yeah, in the arts as as a not just a form of therapy, but as a form of community. And I do think that it is a huge, it is something that can be so wonderful to so many people. And if you don't feel artistic in any way, shape, or form, I think it just generally, I think young men need to start engaging in their hobbies more. Like, what is it that you really love that's not the status quo, perhaps? Um, and engage in that. Like, if the concept of, I don't know, bridge engineering is fascinating to you, then, like, I don't know, there will be places in which you can speak to engineers and like engage in that and have those conversations, and you can find your people there, and you'll have a diversity of opinions. I think so many young men are stuck with inside this like school culture in which you're supposed to be like nonchalant and not care about anything, and this and it's, oh God, it's like asking someone not to be human, you know. The whole, but care, for the love of God, care. Like you do not need to seek out beauty. Beauty is within you. You're just ignoring it. Yeah.
Thank you. And would you like to end perhaps by reading your poignant poem "Flowers," Sam? Would that be okay?
Yeah, of course. Let's do it. Let's do
Thank
it.
you.
Men don't get their flowers till they're dead. A few petals to commemorate the beauty that was there make up for a lifetime of neglect. I wonder if there is an afterlife. Will we see them send flowers to our funeral and still feel that twinge of guilt for loving in that moment, making ourselves vulnerable? No matter how feminine or masculine, how big or how small, we're all going to the same place in the end. We're all a little bit tired and a little bit scared. So tell him you love him. Tell him today, go to his house, pick up some flowers on the way, and lay them in his arms before you lay them on his grave.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, for all of your work and for speaking to us today. It's been really powerful. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and thanks for me
Thank you
too,
so
Sam.
much.
It was great to hear you talking about your work and reading your poems. I really enjoyed it.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
it's our pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, Stephen, picking up on that last poem, Flowers, there, I was just wondering, when was the last time that you gave another man a bunch of flowers?
That's a great question, Sandy. I don't think I've ever given a man some flowers, actually, which is actually sad because my dad, he's very diligent about having flowers in the house. So actually, maybe after this, I will get my dad some flowers. That's a lovely idea.
Yeah, well, I was thinking about that
Yeah,
question. I thought, God, I don't know if I
yeah,
have. I think I have, but if I have, I could count it on the
yeah,
fingers of one
yeah,
hand,
yeah, yeah.
you know? Um,
Very
Kind of
good question.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But anyway, what did you think of the episode that we've just
Oh gosh, yeah,
had?
it was really quite beautiful, really, wasn't it? Just hearing Sam talk so passionately and powerfully and eloquently. Yeah, so many things will stick with me from that. One thing which I did want to come to was this idea, which I think he expressed very well around like therapeutic self-destruction, as he called it, and all the different forms that that can take for men. And what he was saying about the kind of gym culture, though, I do think was very pertinent. It makes me think about our conversation with Brendan Goff. And, I was just talking to my partner a couple of days ago about this. We were talking about how obviously like doctors encourage people to go to the gym, right? But I feel like for so many people, going to the gym isn't actually about self-care. It's self-punishment, isn't it? That you're desperately trying to fit in with this image of what it is to be a successful, desirable person, and that's why you're going to the gym. But you feel like you're a failure, and you're punishing yourself to try and, because you feel so much shame about how you don't fit into that model, and so you're really trying to discipline yourself to do that. But yeah, what about you, Sandy?
Well, I was just going to say, do gyms have to be like that? They don't really, do
Oh
they?
no, I
And
don't think
there's
no, and I'm sure that's not like that for everybody.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
yes.
Because there's a gym quite near me, which I think markets itself as one, that is attractive or should be attractive to people who wouldn't normally go to a gym, if you see
Yeah,
what I mean.
yeah, that's
It's much more
nice. Yeah,
supportive. So
yeah, yeah, yeah.
just to support gym culture a little bit there.
Totally. Oh well, yeah, that sounds great.
But I don't go, by the way, but I always think I should. But
And
I'll
there's the
bear in mind
self-punishment again.
mind your warning about self-punishment. But I was thinking about something different, which was the notion of friendship and how that came up in our conversation. And I was interested and surprised by the way in which he described how he'd moved away from a sort of laddish culture that he was part of. I hadn't really expected him to say that.
No.
He'd moved away from that, but what does that do to your friendships, to your connections with peers? And he also said that it was important, he felt, to remain connected, to remain involved, and to try and undermine some of the sort of patriarchal notions that some of his peers, had learned and lived by. And quite often we think, oh well, they have a very different take on the world. We'll avoid them, reject them, and actually that may not be the right thing to do. And he said you should remain involved, but not preach to people, not preach
Yeah,
to
yeah.
men, but actually subtly challenge. That's important, and I think that has a sort of wider political significance as well. You know,
Absolutely. Yeah,
certainly in
yeah,
the
yeah.
UK context, you often hear people say, well, those people who supported Brexit, they're not intelligent, they haven't thought about this enough. Well, don't reject them, talk to them.
Yeah,
So I
exactly.
felt that was an
Yeah.
important sort of message, and maybe also connected to that the difficulties of transitioning away from a laddish
Yeah.
culture.
Yeah, yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
what you gain and what you lose through that.
Totally. Yes, ironically, that maybe by embracing more of a kind of anti-sexist identity, you can actually become quite lonely, right? Or if you
Yeah.
do stick with those original friendship groups, that can then feel quite alienating, maybe as
Yeah,
well.
yeah. Well, and interesting the way he described going to an arts workshop, which incidentally his
Yeah,
dad,
yeah.
he said, forced him to go to. And then he went back into school but couldn't say anything about it.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking as well, it was very connected to that. It was very interesting, how he made that transition from comedy into poetry, isn't it? And maybe it sounded like he found poetry a more positive, rewarding space and culture and experience for him. And I guess, I don't know much about those different cultures, but I guess the idea you have is that maybe comedy is a bit less welcoming and maybe it is a bit more macho but at the same time, maybe it is a more kind of conventional way for men to kind of somehow express themselves, right? It's through the medium of comedy, but maybe in a much less open and much less vulnerable way, I suppose, than poetry. And And even a man who's more reflective, like Sam, the best he could maybe do with his comedy was to, again, maybe punish himself a bit with his jokes,
Yeah, there's also quite a lot of information around about, the misogyny within the comedy world. Quite a few comedians or female comedians who have talked about being abused by other comedians, actually.
Absolutely.
So yes, that is a significant issue. I wanted to just mention issues around fatherhood as well, because I mean, Sam talked about his dad in a very positive way, but I was interested that he said that he certainly implied anyway that his father had learnt from his children, from his male children,
Yes.
And he'd become more open, more accepting, as a result of the paths that they had chosen. And so I was reflecting that very often we make the assumption that all the sort of learning is top down from parents to children, whereas of course in this example, and I think it has wider resonance too, it's actually the children who are informing the parent, and that's quite a nice reversal, isn't it?
Absolutely. No, I think it's really beautiful, and it kind of subverts that patriarchal dynamic, doesn't it? And that's something that's come up actually in my research about climate change and masculinity, that fathers who are climate activists that I've spoken to, in many cases, were influenced by their children in that regard. And I think that's really, really lovely, isn't it?
Well, I was just coming back to one of the main topics of our podcast, really, around misogyny and violence against women. He said that what he had learned came from women and from women's experience, and that I think when they felt safe with him, they disclosed quite a lot of ghastly things that they had been through themselves, and that was a real eye-opener for him, the suffering that women had been through. And I think there's something important there about the sort of introspection that he engaged in as a result of what he'd heard. And we've there is this phrase, men have responsibility to be introspective, and I think that applies in this case, and it shows what Sam has learned from that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I guess also thinking about it more at the structural level as well, like going back to our previous episode with Dean Peacock, I was thinking as well about how much funding do the arts get? If we want to encourage more boys and all children into the arts, how much funding are they getting? Like in school, for example, if I think about my own time at school, I definitely think the arts seem to be treated with much less of a priority than sport, for example, or STEM subjects. Arts were really down the bottom of the pyramid. So I think that there's something gendered there as well, isn't it? That this more feminized area, seems to get less of a priority. And even poetry, right? That we were saying poetry is seen as a very feminized sphere, but even still, again, when I was at school, most of the poets we studied were men, so even then within those more feminized spaces, there is still that kind of patriarchal hierarchy, I suppose, perhaps.
Yeah. And within that, the place of dance is even more marginal,
absolutely.
Probably.
Yeah.
And even though it did make advances in the early parts of this century, I think partly as a result of COVID, it's declined, and then the funding thing as well. And quite often, I think the way that boys get into dance is through going along with their sister to a dance class when they're quite young, and then it becomes okay somehow. But that's why the COVID point is important, because that wasn't happening.
It's actually really sad, because my two young nieces, they both go to dance classes, but it's predominantly girls. These are very young children, so already at that really young age, like parents aren't really taking their sons to dance often.
Oh well, I know that Bally Boys has a tour coming up. 25 years they've been going, so perhaps we should have a look at that.
Absolutely, yeah. But for now, we should probably leave you to it. But yeah, thank you so much, everybody, as always, for listening. Contact us at nowmen@gmail.com if you have any questions or comments about the show. And do subscribe if you haven't done so already, and take care of yourselves.
And bye for now.
Thanks so much. Goodbye. Bye.